my hotspot. I'm not sure what's going on my Wi-Fi, but
Jason, if you have to turn off your video, then that's perfectly fine too.
no problem. Are we ready to go, or should we give it another second here?
We are live streaming now.
Great.
You're good to go. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Tom Berman.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this combined advancement and development licensure subcommittee meeting. I just want to kind of set the context of what you're going to hear today and make sure we had another session earlier this morning. And so I want to kind of set some guardrails about what you're hearing and what you're and kind of what the how questions should flow to Jason about this. First, I want to say that as we've explored microcredentials, many of our subcommittees have raised questions of kind of how do you do this at scale? How is this possible? And so in an effort to address that question, we have reached out to Bloom Board, which does a lot of microcredentialing work in school districts all across the country, and with an eye to seeing how they do it at scale. So a couple of things I want to put in front of you here is this is not an advertisement for a solution. This is simply helping everybody wrap their head around what this looks like in practice. So we're not setting Bloom Board up here as we're trying to pick somebody to do the work for us or tell us how to do the work. We're leveraging Bloom Board to explain this is what we do with our partners across the country. Also, Bloom Board is not in the position to answer policy questions that are about how much, how little, when, where, is this the right thing or is that the right thing? Like any other vendor, they take their policy direction from their clients. So, you know, asking Bloom Board if somebody can do this, we're going to interpret that as in the context that you work in, Bloom Board, are people allowed to do this? Is that how that response should be interpreted? It should no way be interpreted as Bloom Board telling you what North Carolina should be doing as far as their policies. You are the policy recommending body, so those questions really are questions for yourself rather than for a vendor. So with that said, I hope you find this informative and helpful in kind of getting your mind around how something like this would work at scale. And Jason has been very generous with his time and his expertise, and we really are appreciative of that. And also, he's without emotion in this process. So ask whatever you want to ask of him. It's nothing. He's not going to be offended by any questions or anything. So just put it out there and get the information you need to help you really understand how this is working in other places. And with that, I will be quiet and let Jason take the floor.
Love it. Thank you, Dr. Conlon. Appreciate the time. Let me share my screen. All right, can you all see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
So I will try and make this as collaborative a conversation as possible. I will stop a bunch to ask questions and make sure that there's still space. I tried to get a little bit of a sense from a couple of sort of different committee folks, sort of what questions do the committees have, do the subcommittees have about microcredentialing more broadly, microcredentialing across the landscape at the national level. And so that's really been our goal. Agenda here for today is really talk about like who are we, Bloom Board, and what states are we currently operating in and supporting in the process, knowing that there's sort of obviously very state-specific contexts. And then really get into some questions around what is this thing called a microcredential as we define it, and what's the process to earn one, and what does that look like in sort of different contexts. then really start to talk through sort of how are those MicroCredentials being used across the entire career continuum, right? Ranging from even all the way into paraprofessional certification, into obviously induction, new teacher certification, but even down into sort of high school student dual credit pathways for sort of just exploring the teaching profession. There's lots of different sort of use cases around sort of the licensure world that we're starting to see different states sort of explore in different ways. And so I want to make sure you all have some of that context. And then ultimately, I know one of these big questions that comes up is sort of how do we think about, how do you manage, what are states doing to think about quality control and rigor at scale? And obviously we're moving, part of the idea is moving away from multiple choice tests, moving away from time as a currency. And in some ways, right, those two mechanisms are relatively easy because you can sort of automate them, and they are, attendance sheet based, or they are, sort of can be automatically scored, whereas portfolios cannot. And so it's about how do you sort of manage that at what scale, and sort of how do you think about sort of that overall sort of structure as we sort of navigate and go through the process. So really appreciate y'all taking the time to sort of be here. By quick background, so I'm Jason Lang, I'm the founder, president for Bloomboard. Really excited about the work we've been doing. We've been pretty fortunate to be really sort of working through this over the last 5 to 7 years. We've been around for about 12 years as a company, and we have really spent a lot of time, like our North Star has always been, what will it take to scale the highest quality instruction possible? And obviously technology can be a big part of that. We started out doing a lot of work in PD and professional development, and we built the first Amazon marketplace for PD. We gave teachers millions of dollars of Gates funding to try and build teacher wallets to sort of figure out how they would use that PD and access PD and figure out what would help them get better in their classrooms for their kids. And so we've really sort of learned a lot. And then we've even managed a lot of the observation and evaluation systems for entire states. And so we do a lot of state level work. And ultimately what we've learned is that the PD ops system that we have in place is just really watered down, and in many ways has been broken by the fact that there's just not a lot of great incentives for people to engage in meaningful practice and meaningful change of practice in their classrooms. And that's really what led us to this world of micro-credentialing, which is really about how do we think about sort of moving away from time or multiple choice tests as the currency, and how do we move towards portfolios? And what would that look like if we're doing portfolio-based certification, portfolio-based sort of advancement structures that really allow for teachers to demonstrate their practice, but also really can allow them to engage in meaningful learning around their craft. And so we've been really fortunate to have some pretty amazing, luminaries over the years. So the Gates Foundation, the Dell Foundation, the Steve Jobs Family Office, the Emerson Collective are all investors in the company. We've had some pretty amazing luminaries over the years. So Joanne Weiss was Arnie Duncan's chief of staff. She was on our board for a long time and helped us sort of think through a lot of the state policy work. Tom Vander Ark was actually tapped by Bill Gates to start the education work at the Gates Foundation. And so he was on our board for a long time. And I actually got to present to Bill Gates personally at one point about sort of thinking about the future of education technology and where there's really strong leverage in the process. And so we've been really fortunate and just are really excited to see where this entire world is going. When we think about that, when we think about sort of the broader landscape, it really comes down to a couple of key buckets. And we've seen this sort of play out over the last, 3, 4, 5 years, which is states really starting to think about licensure in really meaningful ways. And so in places like Arkansas, right, they used to have a credit hour system that you could advance through their licensure tiers, and you did it based on hours, and you accumulated those hours based on the number of PD sessions you went to, but nobody ever knew, there was no sort of actual demonstration part of that. And so we worked with the state, we talked to them a bunch, we went back and forth, and they ultimately created a new 4-tier licensure system that actually has demonstration defined in it in portfolios of artifacts in micro-credential form that we support. And so you can go from early career educator to professional educator, and then into teacher leadership and master teacher designations. And that teacher leader, those master teacher designations are defined in sets of portfolios that we sort of can manage and run and sort of order and sort of manage in the process. And so it's a really interesting shift, again, away from time and into that sort of portfolio structure. In Alabama, we're working with the State Department and a couple of the university sort of IAGs to really think about what does that same process look like for some of the high need licensure areas. So special education, certification, ESL, what does it look like to actually sort of codify those practices in portfolios and then use that for those sort of designations for those licensure areas. Places like Texas have done some pretty interesting work really at the policy level, where there's actually a bill called HB 2424 that allows for competency-based, micro-credential-based licensure for all programs of study related to licensure. And so it's really starting to think about, again, how do we sort of adapt our system that we have into portfolios, into demonstration, and then we're doing some work with them around mentor, teacher designations, master teacher designation, and the like. And then Kentucky's also been one of the leaders from the policy standpoint. So about 18 months ago, they passed a new rank change sort of law that actually allows for the formal rank change, the licensure designation in Kentucky, to be portfolio-based and be micro-credentialed in the process. And now we're actually sort of adding to that some computer science and some CTE licensure work as well in the same process. Not surprisingly, as we started to do licensure work, we started to see states start to add on in these sort of different endorsement categories. So, not surprisingly, right, computer science is one of these new areas where, because it's new, right, I think most people would argue that it doesn't make sense that we would use a multiple choice test to actually confer whether or not you can teach computer science well. And so the idea that rather than using a multiple choice test, we actually have a portfolio of of artifacts that we've built into these micro-credentials, and we worked with code.org, we worked with cyber.org to develop those portfolios and define them. That set of micro-credentials has now become the endorsement mechanism in several different states. And then we're using that sort of portfolio structure as a way to think about how do we want to help people navigate and really demonstrate great expertise in computational thinking, in computer science, in classrooms, using artifacts, using videos, using lesson plans in that work. And as we started to do that, right, then we've also obviously started to see folks really move into different licensure pathways for leadership. So in Louisiana, we've actually replaced all teacher leader licensure. We replaced praxis statewide for teacher leader licensure. And so it's a way to then think about, how do the IAGs in the state sort of work and coordinate and embed those micro-credentials into their programming, into their sort of mentor programs. And then we even stacked that teacher leader licensure work into a new competency-based principal license. And so it's really the first of its kind in the country, which is some super interesting work as well. And then ultimately in Illinois, we've been doing a bunch of work with the Wallace Foundation and with Illinois State University and building out a set of leadership for equity micro-credentials. And really now we've just started to get into some leadership for SEL, leadership for EL, for ESL schools. And so really trying to think about what are the competencies that leaders would want to be able to sort of demonstrate at their school sites, and how do they go through that process? And then we've been really excited and really sort of fortunate to have Charlotte Mecklenburg as one of our main partners, doing a lot of their ATR, their advanced teacher roles work, and really starting to define mentor pathways in the same way that we would want to sort of navigate that structure. And so that sort of covers off the teacher and the leader side. The only other one that I would cover that we'll spend a little bit of time on in case it's helpful is really around this idea of, CTE and even down into some dual credit. So in Indiana, we just launched a new grant with the Commission for Higher Education there around, actually helping create, in partnership with Marian University, some dual credit pathways for high school students to actually earn micro-credentials while tutoring in elementary schools for COVID recovery and support roles. And so it's a really interesting way to think about the educator profession. And then they're even working on some new employability skills micro-credentials as part of a graduation requirement for the state. And then in Minnesota, we're doing some CTE. We actually are a statewide approved alt-cert pathway for CTE endorsements. And then in Florida, we're doing a lot of work around paraprofessional certifications now that just recently came out of some workforce pathways in the Florida context. And so let me pause there. I know that is a lot. Again, just sort of excited to share and sort of share about some of this work, and then we'll dig in here about sort of the micro-credential context. But any questions or any areas that we want to dig into more specifically? Okay. And so let's get into the meat of it. So as we really think about this thing, so when we say the word micro-credential, it really means a lot to lots of different people. And so I want to sort of spend some time to just sort of talk through what do we mean by that word, and talk through sort of what does that actually look like in sort of actual practice. The easiest way sort of I like to think about this is sort of imagine right, we were you were planning on having some sort of training around a survival skill. It's like, so everybody's in survival skill mode these days, around how to build a fire. And in a traditional professional learning, in a traditional sort of context, right, I might bring some folks together. If I was doing this at a school site in a district, I'd probably bring my staff together for a PD session or for a workshop, and I'd bring them all to the cafeteria, the library, and then I'd hand out, if I was going to be the facilitator for that, I would come in and everybody'd be sitting at their tent tops, and I would hand out some reading material and a syllabus, and then I'd probably play some videos of somebody building a fire and going through that process. And then we'd do a sort of a normal workshop. So I'd do some breakout groups. We talk about what works, what doesn't. What do you think you'd struggle with while you were trying to build your fire when you're going camping this weekend, right? And we'd sort of go through that process. And at the end, I would have an exit ticket or some reflection document of sorts to say, how did that work? What do you think? And, unfortunately, we wouldn't have actually seen that translate into practice. And if you look at the Joyce and Chowers research, there's a bunch of research that says we know right now, based on traditional professional learning, that only 5-10% of the time does that actually then translate into a change in practice in classrooms. And so the micro-credential world, as we sort of tend to think about it, is really focusing on that doing. And so it's really about sort of building a learning by doing process. So now imagine I was going to lead a separate professional development session, right, inside of a district. And so we would still bring everybody together in the cafeteria, in the library. We would still sort of go through, and we still believe in that collaborative learning. We know that that's really important. And so in our lens, like, MicroCredentials aren't just an asynchronous, self-paced, portfolio you go build, because that misses the opportunity for really deep, meaningful scaffolding and learning that we know is often required in that process. And so we would bring everybody together in a similar, right, in the cafeteria and library, on Zoom, whatever the case may be. And I would still, if I'm that facilitator, I would still want to make sure we covered off some background knowledge. So I would want to make sure everybody really understood, how does airflow work when it comes to building fires? What does that actually look like? And why do we use TPs? And why do we use sort of certain structures to sort of build really good fires? What is that actually doing from a background knowledge sort of standpoint? But then about halfway through that session, I would actually take out of my bag a bag of tinder and kindling and firewood for every single one of you in the room. And I would say, all right, we're going to go outside right now, and we're all going to go build 10 fires together. And while you're building those fires, I'm going to give you really meaningful feedback on exactly what's working and what's not. And really, at the end of that sort of coaching, I'm going to ask you to videotape your own building of a fire. And I'm going to ask you to submit that to, right, an expert in fire building, who's then going to give you sort of very specific feedback and certify, yep, you were able to build a really great fire, nice work. Or here's some things that you can actually improve on. Why don't you go back and try to sort of, do this a little bit better in this thing? And that process, if you had to survive a night in the woods and you had to choose between those two processes and you didn't know how to build a fire, right? That learning by doing approach we know is better. We know the research here is pretty ironclad. It's better for students, it's better for adults. And so that's been the idea, is, right, what would it look like to take that same process and start to really apply that to all the different walks of teaching that we know are so important. So whether that's building positive relationships with students as a really strong, right, sort of induction, as a strong sort of social emotional learning competency, right? What would it look like to not just sort of go through the background content and the knowledge there, but how do we make sure teachers have the tools and the templates and the actual ability to do that in their classrooms and be able to build a portfolio of artifacts that would demonstrate great practice in that way? And if we could do that and use that same sort of very portfolio-centric model, that's really the way we can change the most practice at scale in classrooms for all our kids. Any questions there? Super high level, just sort of about the process, about sort of how we think about that? You can feel free to put them in the chat or otherwise, or just come off mute. Again, we'll try to make this more conversational. Okay. And so as you can sort of see in the way that we've sort of painted this, like, we do tend to think about sort of MicroCredentials, really, right, the MicroCredential itself is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of it is defining that portfolio of artifacts. It is defining the rubric associated with that portfolio of artifacts. And it's defining what good practice looks like through that rubric. And so that's really the idea, is that the micro-credential itself, and I know, again, in the spectrum of micro-credentials, there's folks at one end of the spectrum that are really just about the digital stick, the badge, which, I have my own views on, right? In some ways, I feel like it undermines the sort of the quality of that, but it's a separate conversation. But right, there's folks that are in that sort of digital sticker or the badging landscape where it's about sort of letting people share and show that they've earned a badge. There's obviously a set of folks that are also in this world that are really specific to what is just the portfolio and almost like the performance assessment. And that is the microcredential in its own right. And I think in our world, what we've learned is that just the assessment itself actually falls short of really helping support students, because if you were thinking about your own classroom and the microcredential were defining the rubric, you wouldn't just give the rubric to your students and say, okay, good luck, go sort of get the rubric. You would still build the learning experience around that. And so when we think about the microcredential, we've really started to think about it as a much more sort of holistic experience around that learning experience that is grounded in that portfolio. And that allows for a bunch more sort of integration points. It allows for a bunch more ways to sort of think about how to navigate and support educators in the process. And that's really sort of the way we've been going through it. And so when we talk about a microcredential, you can sort of almost think about all of them are built in this same model, where everyone sort of is aligned. They all have their ability to sort of go through, and you get matched up with a facilitator in a cohort. And so there's sort of a one-on-one coaching aspect to it. And that person could be at the district level, could be at the IAG level, could be sort of in a bunch of different ways, but there's sort of a facilitation model there that's possible and that's sort of critical. And then there's also a cohort mechanism in there. And so its ability to match people up that are all working on the same competency, because again, we know that shared collective rights of engagement is also really important. And then you can think of each microcredential as basically this idea of going through and almost like an action research project or a cycle of inquiry over the course of 4 to 6 weeks, which is really what each of these sort of hexagons, when we think about them, what they look like, over the course of a 4 to 6 week process. And you could think about, going through in the first couple of weeks, really digging in with that facilitator, with your cohort, and digging into, well, what are the demonstrated outcomes that we want to make sure, right, a teacher can show in their classroom? And how are we defining those demonstrated outcomes in terms of good, effective practice? And then what is the background knowledge that might be required to really implement that? And so if you're working on, culture responsive instruction, if you don't really understand Zaretta Hammond's work around asset-based feedback and how you use sort of asset-based framing as a way to engage students, right, that's going to be a shortcoming, and that's going to make it harder for you to actually implement really effective instruction. And so we're building, sort of those learning modules, those artifacts into that structure so that we can get people up to speed on what research might be relevant in that case. And we certainly have folks that will build their own microcredentials, but it's still, the idea is that we know that we're trying to ground in the research. We're trying to make sure people have access and they can learn from that research. But then we don't stop there, where that is, where traditionally a PD would stop. We immediately follow that learning up with, all right, well now, go into your classroom and actually try this out. And go do it with your kids and do the work to actually implement that asset-based feedback protocol. Go implement learner profiles. If you're working with sort of building possibilities for students, go implement those with your students. And it might not go well, right? Teaching is much more art than science. And we know that it can be very hard at times, and every lesson is not certainly a success. And so if it fails, it's okay. That's why you have that facilitator. That's why you have that cohort there to really help support you, help sort of engage and build out some scaffolding for you. But at the end of the day, right, what you're really trying to do is you're going to try that out. You're going to get feedback. And then when you feel ready, you might try it again. You might go through that process. But when you feel ready, then you're going to hit submit. And that portfolio then goes to a certified expert or a certified assessor that can then review that. And in our world, in 5 days, we guarantee a 5-day turnaround time, where that assessor is going to then provide annotated time-stamped feedback on that portfolio for every single artifact and tell you exactly how it aligns to the rubric and the actual demonstrated competencies that we've sort of identified in the process. And the goal is that now, once you get that feedback within 5 days, you'll have had 2 assessors actually review every single portfolio. We'll come back to the assessment a bit, but it allows for a really deep sort of experience that's entirely focused on your craft as an educator and on what you're actually doing with your students in your classroom. Any questions about that process? Sort of how we sort of think about that structure?
I have a question.
Please.
So your facilitators and your assessors who work with these educators and cohorts of educators during the microcredential process, do they have actual educational background and experience to offer coaching, or are they simply education adjacent?
No, so they do. So I'll come back to this when we talk about the sort of rigorous assessment. So every one of our facilitators and every one of our assessors has at least 5 years of teaching, at least 2 years of coaching sort of experience, mentorship experience. And then many of them are nationally board certified as well, which we prefer in the process. And then we also have them go through their own certification and calibration around sort of actually reviewing MicroCredentials to make sure that they're calibrated appropriately and they have some cognitive coaching background as well in the process. And so I'll talk through sort of the rigor of the assessment. But again, part of the work we do at Licensure is to make sure that army of facilitators, that army of assessors, right, we can build that inside of educators from North Carolina. We have some partners. The facilitation is often easier. We'll talk about some of the partnership piece in terms of, how we sort of fit into that. Facilitation, has been done by IAGs and adjuncts and different folks across the system. Assessment gets hard because, it's really about timelines and about sort of capacity. And so we do manage assessment, and even many of our states that have tried to take on their own assessment have ended up struggling with it because, in the state of Arkansas, when they tried to do their induction program, they tried to do their own assessment for induction. As you imagine, they have several hundred educators who submitted multiple micro-credentials inside of the 2 days before the deadline. And they only had a couple folks at the department who were meant to review now hundreds of micro-credentials effectively overnight, or within a very short turnaround. And so the beauty of the technology, the beauty of sort of being a third party, we can sort of build the capacity in systems to help manage that and keep that rigor bar really high in the process.
And then Jason, there was just a question in the chat about how are knowledge gaps identified?
Yep. And so within the micro-credential process itself, there's a bunch of different sort of checks for understanding, a bunch of different sort of self-assessments where the learning modules that are in this sort of step 2 here are meant to really sort of hone in on what are those knowledge gaps and how do you sort of identify what that research is to make sure that you have an understanding what that looks like. And so it either will come up in the first go round where someone will take that self-assessment and they'll say, okay, I feel like I don't understand. I don't know where I have a knowledge gap. I feel like I want to dig in a little bit more here. Or it'll come back in on the feedback. And so some of that annotated timestamp feedback after you do that first assessment, that first review, we'll get feedback that says, oh, looks like you might have a knowledge gap here, right? Why don't you go look at this resource and this resource? They're there for a reason. They're built to really help cover that knowledge gap so that you can go implement that in your classroom. And that sort of process is really built to be a very iterative process in its own. Other questions on just the overall process? Broadly? Okay. And so from there, really, then we can sort of get into, so if you think about that at the more granular level, from there we can really get into the sort of how are micro-credentials then being used or leveraged to support this sort of the whole career continuum. And again, some of this, as Dr. Tomlin said earlier, is really for you all to define because these are policy questions, right? And from the Blue Board side, I think our lens is sort of trying to help sort of navigate, some of what we know or sort of the things that come up as you try and navigate sort of the stackability and the interoperability and the integration sort of components there. And so if we think about this at its core, right, what we've really started to see is we don't, any individual micro-credential, individual competency is not going to be sufficient demonstration of good practice, right? The competencies are a little too discrete. And so what we've then started to realize is that we can start to bundle these things together into multiple micro-credentials, so multiple hexagons. And that this gives us a lot of really interesting ways, not only to sort of embed them into different, sort of IAG structures, but each micro-credential on its own right is effectively equivalent to the grain size of like a Carnegie unit, right? Sort of a normal university sort of credit hour in that structure. And the way we then think about that, as you can imagine, is let's say we're taking this, we would call this a micro endorsement, which is sort of this, 3 credit, 3 micro-credential structure. But the way we tend to think about this is now, if you're really trying to navigate student well-being and support student well-being in classrooms, right, there's actually sort of a progression of the competencies that you want. So you'd want to start off with, how do you make sure that you're building really positive relationships with students? Because you need really strong rapport to really be able to sort of actually address well-being. And so up front, the artifacts in there are going to be, how are you thinking about learner profiles and actually showing students that you care more about them as just students in your classroom, but really that you care about them as whole children who have career aspirations and dreams, and that they're not just sort of students in their own right. And then how are you using asset-based feedback protocols, all of the Zaretta Hammond research, how are you using structures to engage students one-on-one and build that rapport. And so that's really what comes out of that first micro-credential. And then after you finish that, after you go through that, you're doing that well, then immediately you can step into this second micro-credential that's really around assessing student well-being. And that when you're assessing well-being, now you're using the rapport you have with kids to then take a universal screener, right, to sort of have conversations with your students to start to pull data out of them about where they might be having issues, where are they having issues at home, right, what trauma are they experiencing, and how do you sort of get that data, because that's really going to be important as you're trying to sort of think about their overall social emotional well-being. And as you then assess that well-being, once you do that well, and you have that data in that universal screener, now we can then figure out, well, what do you need to do to address that well-being? Because we don't want teachers to have to feel like, in this case, we don't want teachers to have to feel like they have to take on the burden and be the hero, and they've got to do that for all their kids, right? We know that that's a path to burnout. And so when you're addressing student well-being, now you can take the data from your universal screener, and you can use that data to then start to build a map of, well, what are all the resources and supports available to me and my kids, and my students, both at the school level, at the district level, or even at the community level. And so it's about building sort of a resource support map across your sort of school and across your district that now can help a teacher navigate based on the data coming from the screener as to what they can actually plug students into to really help support them in their actual needs. And so that's sort of how we think about this idea of sort of the micro endorsement structure, which is, again, really sort of deep coordinated activities that bind together really good research in a way that helps demonstrate sort of meaningful chunks of instruction that can actually move the needle in terms of teacher practice and in terms of impact on kids and ultimately impact on student outcomes. Questions about that micro endorsement, right? Sort of that interplay and the integration side there? Okay. And then the other lens to this is, right, not only sort of what takes good practice, but obviously a lot of what we're also trying to navigate is what are the standards in play that we need to sort of navigate depending on whatever licensure tier you might be looking at. So for every single micro-credential that exists in our entire world, and so the woman who runs our content team is pretty amazing. She used to be the deputy superintendent or the assistant superintendent for academic content for all of the state of Louisiana at the Louisiana Department of Ed. Under John White. And so a lot of what she has done and a lot of what we've really spent a large amount of time over the past sort of couple of years here is to think about, for every micro-credential, how does it actually map? And you don't have to get into the very tiny print here, but ultimately what matters is how do we make sure that there's not only coherence within the micro-credentials and within individual progressions, but how do we map that against the in-task standards, or if it's a computer science endorsement, the Computer Science Teachers Associations, the CSTA standards, or if it's a special education endorsement, how do we map it against the CEC's, special education standards? And so for every micro-credential that exists, we sort of organize them by either the micro-endorsement or by the micro-credential name. Then we're pulling out and identifying specific competencies at the more individually granular level, and then we're aligning and making sure that we're covering off the in-task standards in this case, and being able to sort of map those to the standards so that there's really strong research base in everything that happens. And whether that's for the in-task standards, this is the version we were working on with Alabama for some of the special education alignment. But ultimately, again, it's the same idea as how are we sort of mapping individual competencies and individual competencies within any given sort of portfolio to a set of standards that sort of makes that research really actionable. Any questions about that alignment piece?
I have a question. This is Vivian Covington. So I see that we think each of those credentials you said was about a Carnegie unit, so a student credit hour. So that looks like 9 student credit hours there. What would that equate to? Is that someone trying to get a new license area? Is that someone trying to get an initial license? I'm struggling with how many of those little hexagons you would have to say someone is good to go. Do you understand my question?
I do. And so if each one of these hexagons, so let me just confirm. So each one of these questions, these hexagons is effectively sort of is Carnegie Union, is that credit hour? That is a policy question. So I'll go back to Dr. Cumberland and say, the question of sort of how much right now, there are some proxies for credit hours in Carnegie units relative to licensure, but ultimately that is going to come down to the question of, for any given, sort of licensure area, whether it's induction, whether it's sort of different add-ons, different sort of advancement, different tiers of the licensure system, what is then PEPSC going to decide is the right amount of stuff to cover in that process and the right set of competencies to make sure that you're demonstrating and the coverage that would relate to it. But that is ultimately a policy question.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the similarity of your chart there to all of the charts we do for our CAPE accreditation for our undergraduate programs. And the performance assessments we have at the end of them, right? Which is a very, 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 very similar looking chart and process.
I mean, Jay, I think our work in other states has produced some sets of norms around, sort of standardized endorsement structure, special education, and things like that. So there's definitely some norms there, I think, right? Talk about this a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, certainly we know.
Yeah, I'd also like to know what you mean by endorsement of that map chart you had, because we use a lot of different terminologies across states. So an endorsement here is like an 18-hour sort of add-on, and does that mean a full credential? If you could explain some of that terminology, because we have a lot of different people on this call, and that may mean different things to them. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, again, that is some state-specific context that obviously what we're always trying to map into is that local state context. So in the Alabama context, they are looking at it as that same, they have an 18 credit hour endorsement for special education and for ESL, right? And that's why we're working with the IAGs to sort of make sure we're covering off that same set of 18 credits. And so that's really the idea is, depending on the state context, depending on the local sort of pieces, really sort of what does that look like? The question is, do we have comparison data of teacher candidates who've used MicroCredentials versus Praxis? So we don't yet. And I think, again, that's part of the conversation that we're going to get into, and part of, I think, what makes North Carolina in particular interesting is you all have a level of data and a centralization set of data that is just, frankly, better than vast majority of the country. And so the ability to do some validation, we are right now operating in about 15 federal grants, EIR, TSL, TIF grants of different likes. And so we have a lot of AIR and WestEd, driven actual sort of program evaluation studies on the MicroCredentials and on the impact to which we can impact, student outcomes. COVID blew some of that up, and so we're still dealing with the data components there, but ultimately we are really trying to focus in on, can we show, in our world, we think about the data a little bit in two pieces. One is, can we show that the MicroCredentials themselves can actually meaningfully change practice? Because that's its own research bar, right? And the question of can we, right now we don't have great data that shows PD changes practice. And so if we can show that MicroCredentials can actually change teacher practice, that can get us pretty far. And then the real question will become is, well, what are the right teacher practices to make sure that we're changing and impacting and sort of certifying to then really be able to see now we can actually improve student outcomes. And so it's getting there, but it's still going to take some time, and it's still early. And I know Melissa's done some work on the New America side as well on that. I don't know if she's back yet, but that would be another question. Other questions on sort of the alignment piece? And then again, to the other question, right, as we think about this and as you all think about the policy context, there is this sense of sort of how do you and where do you draw the line and where do you want to define, right, which licensure tier as you would navigate, as you can imagine, right? So all of these are actual, right, sort of micro endorsements or actual sort of structures that exist, or some versions that we can sort of build specific to the North Carolina context. But still the question remains, where would you define and build, right, the sort of cutoff in terms of what enough practice is for a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 license, and how would that sort of line not only the teacher development side, but also to that leadership pathway, right, for teacher leaders on up into, right, sort of distinguished leaders. And and really sort of thinking about how you build those pathways. Like some of the ATR work is sort of built on top of these same structures, but ultimately that's, I think, the goal is sort of building out and thinking about this not only as sort of progressions of stackable sets of certifications, but also trying to think about how do you sort of stack the entire career continuum, everything from, parapro down into high school CTE, but up into initial certification, into sort of, different, again, some of those licensure, those endorsement areas that have other sort of graduate degree sort of structures in place in that process. Questions on that sort of piece? Okay. And so from here, then we get into probably, one of the big areas that I know comes up all the time, which is sort of how do you think about how are states ensuring quality control? And especially when it comes to sort of some of the rigor and the assessment and sort of the scalability questions, how do we sort of think about managing that? And what are the sort of ways that folks in different sort of stakeholders across the country are doing that? And as we've been going through that process, right, there is this interesting question that it's, based on the world that we live in today, we are all governed by a set of laws and sort of bureaucracy that really sort of has a bunch of, legacy stuff involved in it. And so one of the things that we're constantly trying to think through with our own team and in our own work is we know we have to navigate that bureaucracy. We have to navigate the sort of the licensure rules and the legacy stuff that's in place. But we also know that like the world has changed a ton in the last 10, 20 years. And given all of the benefit of that hindsight now, and given all the benefit of where technology is going, there's a really interesting question is sort of what would the ideal educator licensure sort of system look like if we could start from scratch today? And then if we can start from there, then the part of the question is, well, now how do you then bridge that into the current realities and the current sort of legislative policy structures in place? And so as we started to unpack, as we start to think about that question and that model, really it comes down to a couple of really key pieces, right? Which is, one, I think we'd all acknowledge that it doesn't make sense that we're using multiple choice tests to certify, right, actual good instruction. And certainly there's a place where the content knowledge, but like in terms of actually certifying instruction, we would want to probably see some way to build portfolios and actually use that as a mechanism to certify instruction, because it then can be seen and watched and looked at. And what we also thought might be helpful given the board is to talk about who's involved at what level, right? Sort of from an approver standpoint, or sort of who gets to decide what these things are, right? At the end of the day, right, the idea around who's actually deciding which sets of portfolios, which set of experiences are grounded in research, that is ultimately going to be a PEPSC approved thing, right? And that you might have different sort of folks who go through that process, but it's really going to be about PEPSC deciding what is the bar for rigorous, right, job embedded portfolio based sort of processes, and deciding how people clear that bar. And then that process to navigate that learning environment is obviously going to be managed by some microcredential provider platform, given that there's a technology component to this. And that technology component generally has some part LMS, right? And some part sort of support structures and infrastructure that's just going to need to be persistent. And so that's sort of how we think about that pillar in terms of the jobs embedded side. Again, we walked through a little bit, so I won't dig too much deeper into that. The second piece from that sort of ideal ecosystem standpoint is really something that's around how do you build stackability and integration points into that licensure system so that you can work in coordination with IAGs and advancement. And so all of our partners in the IAG world, it's really around sort of working with those IAGs to sort of navigate the structures that they're dealing with from an accreditation standpoint, right? To navigate all the issues that they're dealing with from an actual sort of approval standpoint. But ultimately, the progression and the stackability of that and the integration points is a policy decision. And how microcredentials fit into different credit systems and how many and at what point and how they sort of fit in, those are policy decisions about how that process gets navigated and gets integrated that really have to be decided by PEPSC. And there's certainly some good precedent that exists today about what that would look like, but those are policy decisions to really make that a coherent progression-based sort of process that can be stackable in a way that really sort of allows teachers to access higher levels of advancement and higher salaries in a way that's really sort of aligned to what's best for kids in terms of outcomes in classrooms. And so that's sort of that stackability piece. Any questions on that, Todd? And then I think in our world, and this is sort of where one of those integration points matters a lot, is really this idea of, are there opportunities in and around that microcredential structure to create coaching and create cohort-based, right, communities of practice, create feedback mechanisms. And so we see this in our licensure work in Louisiana, right? We see this where it's really up to whoever is providing the support, whether it's the IAGs and adjuncts in the IAGs, they're sort of leading and sort of embedding the microcredentials into coursework and the like, or whether it's at the district level, you've got mentors and folks who are coaching on those microcredentials and providing supports, or whether it's sort of actual providers trying to sort of build facilitation into that process. At the end of the day, I think we would argue from all of our experience that you have to have some mechanism for wraparound support and support of those educators, because without it, people are going to get very frustrated because it is a very vulnerable process, right? That, you know, in general, there's a bit of a reason why almost none of you, thank you, Tamika, are actually on video right now. You know, human beings don't like actually watching themselves on video very often. And right, it makes us feel a little bit more uncomfortable. And so the idea that I'm gonna have to videotape myself and upload it to the black box of the internet where an expert is gonna rate me on a rubric is pretty vulnerable. And so there has to be some scaffolding and some support systems around that we sort of want to make available. And again, that's where some of that integration points come into. Well, who supports that support structure, who manages that, and who provides that? And it can be a bunch of different options across the system. And so I'll come back at this in a second, sort of talk about the way that we facilitate that and sort of how we align it. And then the last two pillars are really probably where we spend sort of the assessment process, which is, how do you manage really rigorous and reliable assessment? And how do you ensure that you've got really strong inter-rate reliability? And how do you ensure that we can sort of manage that process very tightly with all the benefit of what we know around, right, all the observation, principal observation data? Like, we know that the processes for doing observation and doing sort of really scalable feedback for teachers is hard, and that it's only harder when you get into portfolios and that sort of process. And so there has to be sort of a centralized management of that assessment. And what we've learned is that assessment has to be really timely. So right now we guarantee a 5-day turnaround time on all assessments, even though we have 2 assessors looking at every portfolio. And if you're not getting right, and anytime we get above that, right, it used to be at 2 weeks. The problem is you just create frustration because teachers get very frustrated by the fact that they're moving on from their lesson, they're moving on from the unit. And if you give them feedback that says that they didn't pass, well, now they're disconnected from the way that they would improve that practice and then be able to sort of modify and sort of rectify whatever feedback they have in response to it. And so that frustration creates, right, ways that teachers just opt out of the system, and that's what ultimately going to create more flight risk and more other ways for teachers to not want to sort of really engage in that practice. And so as we think about these sort of 5 areas, obviously we've talked about the job embedded nature of this sort of portfolio-centric work. We've talked about sort of the research alignment. I think we've gone through a little bit of that stackability and sort of the decision points of where in policy does the state, does PEPSC, does the state board want to sort of fit, and how do they want to stack the actual progressions of which competencies matter for which sets of educators at which tier. As we think about coaching, this is really where probably COVID has taught us better than almost anybody, right? Around just ways to think about supporting educators. And so if we think about, right, in an ideal sense, really the question would be, right, how can we best support folks in their advancement? And in some ways, we've done a lot of different things. We've tried all sorts of different pieces. So we've got, some simulation experiences. We sort of have this academy model. It's almost like a boot camp up front for your first microcredential. And the idea is that we can sort of put a bunch of scaffolds in place and have coaches and have sort of orientations and have some simulations that teachers can engage in to start to get, up to speed on that. And that really what we're then sort of seeing is all of a sudden from there, now you can create, and again, this depends on the district or the IAG and the sort of partner, but we can ultimately start to create some really interesting one-on-one touch points with teachers so that we can move the center of support all the way to the individual teacher. And that may sound crazy, but at the end of the day, like we know for decades now, right, learning and licensure, right, professional development, professional learning, professional licensure has been done sort of to teachers pretty much on everyone else's terms other than the teachers. So here's your release days, here's the times that we can meet, here's the structure. And that we're in a world now where technology is good enough that we can start to do some really interesting work around personalizing that and moving the center of that education to the individual. And obviously it's going to create some capacity constraints that I'll come back to in a second here, which I think came up in the comments. But really what we're starting to see is now building out the mechanisms so that whether it's those adjuncts, whether it's extra mentors, facilitators, where we can actually have one-on-one. So we do this again across tens of thousands of educators. We can now have one-on-one conversations with every single one of them every semester and say, all right, what's going on in your personal life? So you've got these release days, you've got volleyball practice, these afternoons, here's what's coming up, here, these mornings are open. Great. How could you now build and access a set of supports around the competencies the MicroCredentials are working on? And if you really like your peers and you really like being part of a PLC where you can go through and meet, every other week for an hour and talk through sort of that facilitation, great, there are opportunities for you to do that. If you want to just go run and make a ton of progress or buddy up with a teacher down the hall and just make a bunch of progress and start really getting a deep dive into specific artifacts and then set up a one-on-one conversation to get feedback from a coach or a facilitator, great, you can do that too. And if you want to be entirely self-paced, I don't know how people do it. I have 4 kids, I can't imagine how people navigate the world of sort of self-paced learning. But if you want to be entirely self-paced, we have folks who can do that too. But the point is, it all depends on you as the educator and how do we support the mechanisms for that level of personalization all the way down to the individual. And that's really where I think we've sort of seen a lot of pretty amazing sort of feedback. And so let me go back to a couple of questions in here.
Yeah, a couple.
So have you surveyed beginning teachers that are using these MicroCredentials to meet license requirements? Here to how they seem to manage all the MicroCredential requirements as well as their teaching and other duties. So it's a great question. So when we survey the teachers, what we actually find is because the MicroCredentials are built on their practice, right? There's actually some tools even in the system where it's about identifying the things that you're already doing. So if we're working with new teachers in induction programs and working on classroom management, right, we can actually tee up ahead of time and say, okay, that, right, the routines and procedures MicroCredential you might be sort of submitting, here are the artifacts you're going to use. And that new teacher is already probably wondering what ways they're going to navigate routines and procedures. And so teeing up artifacts that they can use that are research-based actually lightens their load. And then they go try that out and they get feedback and they implement it. And so it's about not necessarily having extra outside time that they have to spend that's additive to the day. It's about using the time in their current day that's already working on their craft and then building the artifacts and using that to get feedback. And so the added support there is then talking with their coach or the facilitator or their cohort about how it went and how it worked. And that's really just about getting good feedback on your craft. But the feedback we hear from educators is that the fact that it doesn't feel like it's sort of pulling you in a different direction, it's pulling you deeper into your craft. And that's really what people love about it. And the feedback we have is pretty amazing in that way. And then another question, does that answer the question about the sort of, and a question I will just say, we don't have enough mentor support for our current structure. And I think that's right. And so, one of the things that comes up quite a bit is, the way that we manage mentorship, the way that we manage licensure today is, right, doesn't have enough capacity. And so that's actually where we tend to play a little bit of this role of sort of helping sort of organize capacity that exists and then providing spillover capacity, which is, we have an army of facilitators and folks that we can sort of support, but it is ultimately trying to push into those more individualized structures and trying to let the MicroCredentials, let the portfolio do the heavy lifting of that mentorship. And so you can get more capacity out of existing mentors and existing facilitators because the language is super clear as to what is needing to be produced in classrooms. And it allows for a much deeper conversation much faster. But we also know, right, that the system is capacity constrained in all sorts of areas. And so part of what we're trying to figure out is how do we then build, so if we think about, a statewide rollout or a state level sort of work in North Carolina, there's a lot of educators. And so there are ways to build North Carolina and sort of recruits from North Carolina educators to be those mentors and to create stipend systems and create other systems. Again, that goes into some of the policy, but there's definitely interesting ways in Kentucky right now with the licensure system we have there. There actually is a single mentor assigned to every single educator that goes through this new rank change program we have. And all of those, vast majority, probably 90% of the mentors we've recruited from Kentucky to be the mentors. And ideally, we're trying to push them into even at the local district level. So how do we find mentors at the district that can then support the content that's happening right in that program? And if that can be in coordination with an adjunct or in coordination, right, with sort of the different support structures, that's the win, because we're tying local structures and supports in place to, right, a broader licensure system that can exist. There's a question from Jill. I'd like to hear more about how you interact with IAGs, particularly in states that are using MicroCredentials for licensure. How does it affect enrollment in traditional teacher prep programs? So again, it really depends on the different structures that the states are using. So for sort of specific examples, so like with Dallas College, they're using MicroCredentials sort of as a element to the fourth year of their bachelor's degree, but they're using the MicroCredentials as part of the course infrastructure in that sort of process. And the MicroCredentials are sort of codifying the field experience of that residency program. And so the adjuncts and the professors that are leading those courses, right, they're still guiding those students through the courses, but the students, their portfolios and the performance assessments are coming from the MicroCredential in that process in the way that sort of we would navigate that. And so it really just depends. It's sort of a state-specific, IAG-specific context in terms of how those states are trying to navigate. Again, whatever the bar is. If it's just a credit hour bar in Louisiana, for instance, for that teacher leader work, in that case, the university, so LSU, they have a mentor training program, and they're then using and they're building the coursework for their new mentor program. They're just building it on top of the portfolio and the artifacts that are required in the MicroCredential. And so in that case, like they're providing all the facilitation, they're running the course entirely on their own, but they're using the artifacts from the MicroCredential to provide the architecture for how they're designing that course, so that when somebody graduates from their program, they already have been producing the artifacts that they're going to need to get that mentor license. Does that make sense?
So in that case, is the IAG paying for the product or the student?
Both, and actually the state is also. So the payment structure it can be, again, we're about as flexible as you can get. In the Louisiana case, they have context where the state is paying for parts or all in some cases, right? The higher ed institution, depending on the structure, is paying for some or parts of it. And in some cases, the individual teacher is paying for parts or something. So that's, again, part of the policy context is, right, so how does that fit into, it is more than just a normal licensure exam, a la Praxis, but it can be funded in a couple different ways, in many different ways in the process. Any other questions on the support piece and on that, sort of how we think about supports around work?
I have a question. So, is the support aligned to the area in which the teacher candidate wants to go to, or is it just broad support? Like, for example, I'm a music teacher. So would I get another arts person to help coach me on my thing towards licensure, or is it just a general person in education? So again, obviously this will depend on the content area. So like arts, computer science, so like in our computer science work, all of the facilitators are computer science certified educators. So the goal is to make sure that we've got people with the backgrounds and the certifications and the training in those areas. And then again, not surprising, right? The more people who go through that MicroCredential in those areas, the more we can recruit from those people to provide those supports in that process to help build that system. Because, especially in the content areas, you just need, you're not going to have, if you're doing really deep math work, like in Alabama, they're rolling out a new math course of study. And so like the competencies, you need to have math background to be able to sort of lead the facilitation, because that content
that content area matters, and you've got to have that background. And so we definitely spend a lot of time trying to make that match work. Love it. And so then the last sort of area that we sort of can talk through here is really around, how do we think about assessment? And we've come back on this a couple times. We've already covered this a little bit, but just to sort of tie it out, when we think about assessment, and this is part of, I think, the questions that come up around just sort of broader infrastructure, right? Whether it's no matter what route you go, right? Someone has to do the review to do the assessment. And ideally, right, that's not a checkbox. Ideally, that's a really thorough analysis of that video and that lesson plan and that student work, and a way to really annotate, and specifically, so in our case, right, teachers upload videos, and then the assessors are required to basically annotate and timestamp. So at 2 minutes and 16 seconds, a little bullet pops up in the video that describes how that instructional practice at that moment in time meets a specific indicator and criteria in the rubric. And the idea is, right, that's the level of detailed feedback that can feel really actionable to educators. And so to do that across thousands, right, in this case, we now do tens of thousands of MicroCredentials submissions. We review them every year. And to do them in sort of that 5-day interval just requires a very large and complicated set of infrastructure that, frankly, technology can manage and can be really helpful with. But it does mean that it sort of takes a lot of infrastructure for that. And so the way that we think about sort of rigor and assessment is, one, it's really about finding very qualified and certified assessors. So we talked about this before. Every single assessor has 5 years of teaching experience, 2 years of coaching experience. A bunch of them are nationally board certified. Not surprisingly, we use a micro-credential to certify them to make sure that they can actually provide very targeted feedback and rate against a master scored micro-credential with sort of a strong calibration. And so they've got to pass that micro-credential just to even get into the process. And then we have an ongoing process for managing them that's really about sort of calibrating and managing inter-rater liability as we're going through that. And so this may not be clear, I don't think we've talked about it yet, but every single submission is basically double blind. So the applicant, the teacher never knows who does the review. The reviewer never, all of the personally identifiable information, the PII, is stripped out of the portfolio. And so we try to keep that a very double blind process. And then there's actually 2 reviewers, 2 assessors for every single submission. And so they're going through, they're annotating, they're timestamping that sort of feedback. They're going through that review, and then we manage that inter-rater liability outside of that 80% threshold for, which, according to the research, according to the statistical significance, is basically perfect. And that's really what we spent time on, sort of building the infrastructure to manage rigor across thousands of submissions in any given month. And that really is sort of one of the big sort of stumbling points, because portfolio-based assessment is hard, but we now have enough technology that it can be done really well. And we are also building out a set of really interesting tools for the future that are leveraging machine learning, leveraging sort of artificial intelligence to make that process faster and more efficient. And again, we are nowhere near being able to have, and I'm not sure we will ever get to a place where we can actually have fully automated, sort of feedback structures. That's just not going to sort of manage that. But it still comes down to the fact that, right, we do know there are ways that, machine learning and sort of AI can help assessors make that process faster and more efficient. And so we've been building out a bunch of those tools as well. There's a question in chat, is how writing dependent are the MCs? It really depends on the competency. And so if you think about sort of the MicroCredentials are obviously going to be related to lesson planning, curriculum mapping, right, are going to be more writing intensive. We've been working in South Bend with the Writing Revolution folks around sort of thinking about sort of their ELA, their sort of writing processes, and sort of think about sort of the micro-credential certification process for the Writing Revolution, given their work is pretty amazing and pretty sort of strongly sort of aligned. And so it really just depends. Obviously, that's different than if you're working on something that's much more pedagogical in nature, or that's much more sort of classroom practice based. And so it just depends on the overall process for what MicroCredentials and how writing dependent they need to be.
So can you talk a little bit about diversity and equity in terms of bias in these? Because this is very similar to a lot of what we have our students do in terms of the EdTPA. National Writing Assessment, and folks say, well, if you're not a good writer, you don't pass, or that's biased to a particular subgroup of folks. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and it came up in the earlier conversation, so it's super helpful context. When we think about sort of the bias, again, I feel like part of the problem in traditional assessments, right, is the one-sided nature of that assessment. And so part of the reason we built that facilitation and that coaching structure is to help navigate and mitigate the bias that can be inherent in assessment. And so by being able to have ways to get feedback, ways to respond to that feedback, ways to dig into that sort of coaching support structure, it allows for us to sort of manage and sort of mitigate some of that bias. And at the same time, it's about having good quality control systems to be able to look at the data behind the MicroCredentials and be able to update and understand where that bias might exist so that we can continually calibrate against it and make sure that we're sort of getting something that has really strong, right, sort of reliable data behind it. But I do feel like that the support structure we've built has been really one that is meant to try to remove as much bias for the actual sort of overall process, because having it not just be a one-sided summative thing that gets submitted, right, but having it be much more sort of coaching-centric allows for that set of coaches, that set of facilitators to help support in a way that really sort of has sort of that structure built in. And then obviously the calibration and the certification processes with assessors comes in to sort of really make sure that we're navigating and mitigating and responding to that ongoing, right, monitoring of the data that's coming through that process.
But if I'm understanding you correctly, the person that's coaching me is not the person assessing the microcredential.
That's right. Yeah, we do keep that because that bias is obviously pretty inherent. So we want to make sure we separate that and make sure that there's a set of objective criteria we're using for assessors to really sort of ground that process.
Yeah, I guess that was kind of my point, because the NTPA assessors are calibrated, but folks still say there's bias in that. So that was kind of where I was going, but I appreciate the answer.
Yeah. I mean, again, like at the end of the day, like I'm not, it would be crazy to argue in any context that you're going to be able to create a perfect assessment that's not going to have bias. I think the question is, what can we do to wrap around that assessment process to mitigate that bias and to respond to it as it comes up so that the assessments can get better faster in the process and that we can sort of navigate that. So that goes into sort of the progress monitoring work. And obviously the coaching piece can be helpful, but right, that's a very hard bar to sort of get to, right, sort of perfect unbiased assessments overall.
Plus the two-step assessment process helps with that as well, right?
Other questions? Yeah, Melissa, I don't know if you want to share the coaching sports piece.
Sure. I just popped in the chat, and sorry for missing the first part of this, but just popped in the chat that we've done quite a bit of work just on how do we help a more diverse group of students successfully complete post-secondary education, and it's those same types of supports that are really shown to be most helpful. I mean, of course, financial support is part of it as well, but the sort of academic advising, coaching, mentoring supports that when those are provided to students, we just see a much higher rate of completion and degree attainment. And so I was just reflecting on the fact that those are, I think, sort of common factors in sort of supporting a more diverse group of students, or in this case, teachers, in being successful in these kinds of processes.
It's fundamentally, it's one of those reasons why we put those teacher support systems in place. It really has to exist. And then the last piece, as we sort of finish off here, is really think about like the timeliness. And again, I know I've pressed on this, I probably say this a lot, but at the end of the day, like we have so much experience with educators being frustrated by the fact that they submit something. And again, put yourself in an educator's shoes from an empathy perspective, right? If you went through this vulnerable process and you videotaped yourself and you weren't all that comfortable with it in general, because videotaping yourself feels a little uncomfortable, and then you upload it to the black box of the internet where a double-blind assessor, two assessors are going to rate you and give you feedback. And if you then go a week and you don't hear anything, and then you go 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and now you've moved on from the lesson, you've moved on from the unit, you're getting further away from that context, and then you get your assessment, you're gonna be really frustrated and really angry about that. And unfortunately, there isn't a way at the end of the day, right, to actually create very uniform submission rates, right? Because what happens is people set deadlines, and as much as you might say, well, there's only 100 or there's only a couple thousand educators, and so they need to submit a couple, 5, 6, whatever it is, micro-credentials each. What ends up happening is you set those deadlines, and then everybody submits in the 2 days beforehand. And so all of a sudden you've got aggregated hundreds, if not thousands of submissions that come in effectively overnight, and you're trying to navigate and manage, right, really timely feedback. And that's where all the bottlenecks come in. And that not only constrains and pulls on your rigor, but that obviously pulls on, right, the sort of timeliness of that feedback. And so a lot of what we spend time on is really guaranteeing. So we have 99.3% of our submissions are reviewed in 5 days. And we spend a lot of time making sure that sort of almost real time. I'm trying to get our team to 3 days. They're mad at me for that. But like at the end of the day, like the goal is to try to get assessment to as close to real time as possible, because it really matters. And it matters to educators almost more than anything else in terms of making sure that they've got targeted feedback, it's really high quality, and that comes. So, as you think about how to navigate, making sure that those people is really, really important.
You're breaking up a tiny bit.
Justin. Questions? All right. Any other questions? Helpful? A bit from my, point, so start off a bit. Other questions? The sort of different policy environments, different sort of.
Yeah, Jay, you're breaking up pretty bad. Perfect timing.
Don't know why that would be. It says I'm okay.
Sort of back there now.
All right. Am I back now?
Yes, you're good now.
All right, sorry. So that is really, I'm just saying, so that's sort of the end of everything we have to share. Any other questions, thoughts, comments, concerns about the work and about sort of what's happening across the country, about sort of how this, again, sort of fits into the world that you all are navigating? Dr. Tomlin, anything else you would want to add to this, if you're still with us?
I am still with you. Where else would I go? No, I just want to reinforce to folks, this is about, one of the universe of possibilities that could lead to kind of a statewide system around micro-credentialing for the purposes of meeting licensure qualifications. I would really urge you all to kind of dig in on their process to see, what if, and ask questions if, well, let me throw one out rather than pushing folks to ask another question. So, do you gather feedback from teachers on their experience and with this process, and as much as you can step away from your role of self-advocacy, do teachers hate it? Do they love it? Is it just another thing to do? Do they feel, I think ostensibly one of the benefits of micro-credentials is that it's job embedded and that it feels like part of what they're doing. Do teachers experience it that way, or do they feel that it's something else they have to do on top of what it is they're doing?
Yep, so we collect a whole lot of surveys. So we survey people multiple times throughout every single process, because we're constantly just trying to learn. And really, even getting to this point, this is based on just thousands of data points of teacher feedback as we've been sort of working over the last several years to try to understand what that looks like. So we have, I can share some of the sort of the points in time that we actually collect data. Ultimately, that data, right, is generally pointed to, we know teachers struggle up front, right? They struggle with this new type of learning because they really immediately confront this, right, portfolio and the video component. So one of the pieces we got early sort of feedback on teachers, like the first time you have to videotape yourself, you sort of hesitate. And so now we have some simulations and things that we've built to try to sort of lower that bar and make that feel like, all right, well, if my simulation is just me clicking, record on my screen cam, right, on my computer, right, and I don't have to submit it to anybody and it just goes in the system, but I get to experience watching myself, that's a way to lower that bar and make that easier to get more comfortable, right, sort of what that should look like and how to sort of actually navigate, how to sort of engage in this new type of learning. What we do see emphatically, and the data is pretty clear, is that first micro-credential takes a little longer, and teachers are definitely a little more apprehensive, but the acceleration through numbers 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever the case may be, is very clear. And the submission rate. So, our first time completion, our first time passing rate on your first micro-credential is probably 64%, somewhere in there, sort of mid 60s, depending on the micro-credential for your first time submission. But that submission then rate, that goes up as you do your first submission for subsequent micro-credentials. And so you sort of see that teachers, they feel it. Often, I think what I'm always guessing is some of them are just testing the boundaries. So they're like, well, let me see if there's like a robot on the other side of this thing. And they're sort of, testing it out and seeing if it really is somebody that's actually going to provide feedback. And so a lot of our systems, a lot of what we do is just spend a lot of time surveying teachers and asking, where do you need help? Where do you get stuck? What do you need? And then how can you build, right, sort of the touch points to really help create that scaffolding? And what does that need to look like to really make it powerful from that educator experience? And so we have seen teachers really start to have, again, the feedback's pretty amazing, but it's also one of these things like I feel like everybody has had that PD experience where it just hasn't felt relevant and it hasn't felt like it actually fits your work. And so the fact that we can all of a sudden make that experience incredibly grounded in your craft, it does give a level of feedback to teachers that they just often have never had access to. And so that we do hear resoundingly over and over again is just the connectedness. We do hear that they're hard. So we did a teacher appreciation dinner in Illinois on Monday, and this woman who was amazing, she had done, I think she was at like 12 micro-credentials, and she must have said 10 times, like, it is challenging. Like it is not, like, we're not messing around when it comes to rigor. But she said, like, the feedback she got on her actual practice was better than anything she had ever gotten in her actual work, because it was literally sort of by the timestamp, it was sort of identifying what she was doing and helping sort of give really thoughtful perspective on what that looked like. And so that's really sort of the question is like, how do we make it really deeply meaningful? Because even if it's a little harder, which it is, we know it is, but if it can be really meaningful and there's really good incentives to it, right, that's ultimately going to carry the day.
Great, thanks. I know in the first session you talked about this a little bit, but I didn't catch whether you covered it in this session. The relationship between micro-credentials and having these standardized demonstrations of practice, how is that informed evaluation processes?
Yeah. So it is, I joked, I quipped in the earlier session, somebody had talked about sort of principal observation. And, when we think about the data, we do have data that says that we can improve teacher observation, right, sort of ratings. Teacher observation ratings at their core are spurious at best, was sort of my quip on that, which is we know that there's not a ton of reliability because of all the bias that happens with in-person observation. It's really hard to have good data there. And so Texas, in their example, so Texas has now, at the Department of Ed level, has actually approved micro-credentials to replace their teacher observation scores, right, for their rating system, for their teacher observation system. And it's been really interesting. It's a fascinating sort of mental model to think about, because all of a sudden what that does is that takes the role of a principal who used to be an evaluator walking into a classroom, and it changes that person into an advocate to try to help you as the teacher actually build the right portfolio so you can pass. And that change in the dynamic is super interesting, and that because it's a double-blind assessment, because it's a third-party assessment from a certified calibrator reviewer, it can still stand for the actual observation and the actual rating on the Danielson sort of framework, but it allows it to be sort of third-party and allows it to be sort of double-blind, which allows for principals to have a ton of both their time back, but also change their dynamic in their role with educators to focus on what great craft, what great instruction looks like, and less about the quibbling of sort of, well, you know, you don't like me or you don't like, you know, sort of all those different pieces that we know come up over and over again.
I'm not sure if this is an appropriate question, so if it's not, just tell me it's not. Kind of across all the partners you have, your entire client base, approximately how many teachers are you serving with this system?
I mean, so again, I think in the orders of, you know, sort of, I'd have to get into sort of, I can tell you that we now have tens of thousands of submissions that we sort of manage every year. It's obviously lumpy by which programs and which sort of structures. But, you know, we have gotten to a place where right now our assessment team, they're already working on how do we navigate 100,000 submissions a year to be able to sort of think about the scale that we're managing against. And that we know that's a clear future that we're marching towards. And so the order of magnitude, you know, in the grand scheme of things, like there probably are not, some of the badging systems are probably a little different. But I would say, you know, nowadays in the world, right, even many of the other sort of micro-credential providers probably don't have 1,000, you know, or several thousand total submissions, and we do a lot of that in a month at this point. So I would say a lot of the experience we have from an assessment and the scalability is really trying to set, you know, what that future of rigor looks like and make sure that there's a really high bar there, because we know that that's going to be key.
Excellent.
So I'd like to know what the teachers who don't like it say why they don't like it. That's a little more of a hardball question than Dr. Tomerlin's been asking.
I mean, so again, I would say, like, it is different, to be clear, right? And, you know, we are asking teachers to do a lot. And so we definitely find that teachers will get frustrated by saying, we'll say, like, well, I have a master's degree in education technology. Why do I have to demonstrate this? And we're sort of like, because that's the demonstration bar, right? That's what good practice looks like. And that has not been the norm, right? Teachers are not used to a world where, right, they're getting that third-party assessment from it. And so it does feel different, and it does feel, right, sort of rigorous in terms of what we are asking teachers to be able to sort of build in a portfolio. In the same way I think you'll hear teachers say about National Board, right? It's obviously very different in the scale, but teachers say National Board is really rigorous and big, and it was a bunch of work that they had to do, but it was also the most profound professional, right, development of their careers. And so we do hear that because it is, right, it's not a check the box in any way, shape, and form. And I think without the support systems, that's actually why we've built a lot of the one-on-one coaching pieces, is in the early days, a lot of the teachers who pushed back said, you know, you give me a rubric and a portfolio, but I'm not exactly sure what you mean or how to do this or what we need there. And so, like, the pushback kept coming from the fact that there wasn't enough scaffolding, which is why we've really tried to move with the concept of microdosing away from just performance assessment. Performance assessment isn't enough. And, you know, to the point, I think in the chat around, I don't know anything about Orange County's sort of microdosing or badging system. I can almost bet you that, right, the support structures around it were not sufficient in a way that could get teachers comfortable, because we are combating vulnerability. And teachers will push back. If you make them feel vulnerable, they're already feeling a little vulnerable as a profession, right? Teachers are a pretty downtrodden group right now because they have not been getting the love they deserve. And so by taking that and then putting in place more vulnerability without support is going to make it really frustrating. And so that's where we really spend time, and we are pretty vehement and adamant about it. Again, it doesn't have to be our support, but somebody's got to provide the support. and make sure that there's really clear coaching and really clear feedback. And even in Kentucky, where we have teachers who will push back, once they get some really good coaching and scaffolding, we've been able to turn people who, would be the folks who our administrators come to us and say, oh, I couldn't believe once she said that she loved this, and I knew y'all were doing good work, because she was one of my, folks who would always have said, no way, this wasn't going to actually sort of really help my staff.
And I would even add that some of the folks who have started out as a little less fond of the process, probably because they thought it would be easy and thought they would pass the first time and didn't, through the supports that we're able to provide, the targeted feedback from assessment and the coaching, when those folks get to success, they actually become some of our biggest advocates, because they get a fuller understanding of the process and the supports and the bias toward helping them to succeed ultimately, even though we're maintaining the rigor bar assessment.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but some of the comments in the chat. So yeah, you dangle the carrot in front of the teacher because that's the only way you can make more money, so I'm going to do it, but that doesn't mean I have to like it. The other part of that is, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about you have to do this to get licensed, or you have to do this to get to teacher level 4 or 5 within PEPSC. So to me, I would hope people want to do it and do it for the right reasons. But the carrot is still there. We're making them do it to get to another level. We're making you do it to keep your job, right? And so it's this idea that teachers aren't doing anything. And I would argue, you said something earlier about someone with a master's degree being indignant. Quite frankly, I'm tired of hearing that our master's degrees are not rigorous. They are. And I feel the need to put that out there.
Yeah, again, don't disagree at all. It's just, I think the question is, it's a framing question on sort of how people think about this sort of learning and what that is and sort of the expectations there. But again, the carrot matters. And yes, I would love a world where teachers really felt, right, all teachers felt like they sort of, wanted to get better for their kids. I think we also live in a world where teachers are just really strapped. And they've got a ton going on, and they, trying to add time to their plate while sort of keeping rigor is just not fair to them. And so part of this is like, can we use their time better to still establish a really high bar for, sort of learning and support? And we're seeing the same thing happen in other industries and other professions, where it's about really trying to use degree pathways, on-the-job learning in ways that can help people advance, but do so in ways that are much more tightly aligned with their actual day job and the actual work they're doing, because that's going to give them the best, right, learning experience, and they're going to really love it as part of the process, but it also aligns and doesn't pull them in a different direction.
Yes, I had a question about that. Do you have any feedback or data from educators who have participated in your licensure micro-credentials regarding the fact that were they given enough time to complete the micro-credentials? Because one of the things that, like you said, our educators have a lot on their plate. And so that's part of one of the reasons why some people do the pushback, is because it's just one more thing on top of another. And most of the educators that I know and work with like micro-credentials because it is very close to some like self-led professional development that they're deeply invested in. But they just don't have the time to dedicate to going through all the different components. And so do you have feedback from educators when they're given ample time and space to really dig deep into the learning potential of micro-credentials?
Yep, and it's actually why we built the support system in this way, is to so there isn't a time limit, right, in terms of how and when people can go through that, and that the coaching sort of structures are there to be open-ended so that we can navigate, right? Teachers can make progress when they have time, when they can create time and space to be able to access that same work. And so I feel like that is exactly what, right? We know the school year is lumpy by design. And so it's ultimately about, the onus becomes then on the support structure to make sure that when teachers have a little bit of time to make some progress, that it's available, but that there's not sort of super rigid, sort of deadlines in place to, right, sort of have some issues. Again, there's some policy implications for that. That is for PEPSC and for you all to decide in terms of how you want to manage it. but certainly like our goal from the support side and from the self-paced nature side of the work is that you should be able to have access to on-demand supports, right? An educator in general should be able to have access to on-demand supports that can help them when they need help as soon and quickly as possible to make progress while they're on the job. So it's not, right, it's not sort of navigating and pulling them in another direction or adding to the plate.
So this is Tom. I want to ask Dr. Covington a question, and I just, in general, maybe I have it wrong about what I've been hearing in the subcommittees, but this would be an option, one of many options for teachers in terms of licensure. So the comment about we're forcing them to do it, I'm not, are you perceiving it differently that the subcommittee is considering this being the only option for developing for supporting teacher licensure?
No, if you looked at our minutes, that's certainly not what we've said.
Oh, okay.
My question is to the experiences of the teachers who have done them. So, I keep thinking we have this wonderful North Carolina New Teacher Support Program that if we would simply pay for every teacher to have a new mentor in years 1 through 3, and they do professional development with them, I feel like we're creating a whole nother system that's going to cost money, that people are going to have to be hired, someone's going to have to manage it. And we have a lot of these components already in North Carolina, but they're not completely funded. So that's where some of my questions are coming from.
Thank you. All right. Any other questions from the group? All right. Well, Jason, I really appreciate, again, your time, your generosity of time and expertise on helping us understand how, just kind of a proof of concept of how this could possibly work for managing microcredentials for the purposes of supporting licensure. With the blessing of our co-chair, or 4 co-chairs, that would be Dr. Marr, Maureen Stover, Dr. Bullock. I don't know if Dr. Bullock's on.
She is not. She's not.
And Dr. Wood, I would propose that we finish up the meeting.
Tom, I agree.
Great.
I also agree, Tom.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much for attending, and I hope you enjoy the 20 minutes back, and I hope you all have a wonderful holiday.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate the time.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.